Why nations fail. Chapter 1st. So close and yet so different. The economics of the Rio Grande. The city of Nogales is cut in half by a fence. If you stand by it and look north, you will see Nogales, Arizona, located in Santa Cruz County. The income of the average household there is about $30,000 a year. Most teenagers are in school, and the majority of the adults are high school graduates. Despite all the arguments people make about how deficient the US healthcare system is, the population is relatively healthy, with high life expectancy by global standards. Many of the residents are above age 65 and have access to Medicare. It's just one of the many services the government provides that most take for granted, such as electricity, telephones, a sewage system, public health, a road network, linking them to other cities in the area and to the rest of the United States. And last but not least, law and order. The people of Nogales, Arizona can go about their daily activities without fear for life or safety and not constantly afraid of theft, exploration, or other things that might jeopardize, afraid of their investments in their businesses and houses. Equally important, the residents of Nogales, Arizona take it for granted that with all its inefficiency and occasional corruption, the government is their agent. They can vote to replace their mayor, congressman, and senators. They vote in the presidential elections that determine who will lead their country. Democracy is second nature to them. Life south of the fence, just a few feet away, is rather different. While the residents of Nogales, Sonora live in a relatively prosperous part of Mexico, the income of the average household there is about one-third that in Nogales, Arizona. Most adults in Nogales, Sonora do not have high school degree, and many teenagers are not in school. Mothers have to worry about high rates of infant mortality. Poor public health conditions mean it's no surprise that the residents of Nogales, Sonora do not live as long as their northern neighbors. They also don't have access to many public amenities. Roads are in bad condition south of the fence. Law and order is in the worst condition. Crime is high, and opening a business is a risky activity. Not only do you risk robbery, but getting all the permissions and greasing all the palms just to open is no easy endeavor. Residents of Nogales, Sonora live with politicians, corruptions, and inaptitude every day. In contrast to their northern neighbors, democracy is a very recent experience for them. Until the political reforms of 2000, Nogales, Sonora, just like the rest of the Mexico, was under the corrupt control of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, PRI. How could the two halves of what is essentially the same city be so different? There is no difference in geography, climate, or the types of diseases prevalent in the area, since germs do not face any restrictions crossing back and forth between the United States and Mexico. Of course, health conditions are very different, but this has nothing to do with the disease environment. It is because the people south of the border live with inferior sanitary conditions and lack decent health care. But perhaps the residents are very different. Could it be that the residents of Nogales, Arizona are grandchildren of migrants from Europe, while those in the south are descendants of the Aztecs? Not so. The backgrounds of people on both sides of the border are quite similar. Valley of Los Nogales. Here, on either side of the border, the two cities rose up. The inhabitants of Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora share ancestors, enjoy the same food and the same music, and we would hazard to say have the same culture. Of course, there is a very simple and obvious explanation for the differences between the two halves of Nogales that you have probably long are not so lucky. They live in a different world shaped by different institutions. These different institutions create very desperate incentives for the inhabitants of the two Nogales and for the entrepreneurs and businesses willing to invest there. The incentives created by the different institutions of Nogales and the countries in which they are situated are the main reason for the differences in economic prosperity on the two sides of the border. Why are the institutions of the United States so much more conducive to economic success than those of the Mexico, or for that matter the rest of the Latin America? The answer to this question lies in the way the different societies formed during the early colonial period, and institutional divergence took place then, with implications lasting into the present day. To understand this divergence, we must begin right at the foundation of the colonies in North and Latin America. The founding of Buenos Aires. Early in 1516, the Spanish navigator Juan de Solis sailed into a wide estuary on the eastern seaboard of South America. Wedding ashore, de Solis claimed that the land was for Spain, naming the river the Rio de la Plata, the river of silver. Since the local people possessed silver, the indigenous people on either side of the estuary, the Chiaras in what is now Uruguay, and the Curandi on the plains that were to be known as the Pampas in modern Argentina, regarded the newcomers with hostility. These locals were hunter-gatherers who live in small groups without strong centralized political authorities. Indeed, it was such a band of Chiaras who clubbed de Solis to death as he explored the new domains he had attempted to occupy for Spain. In 1534, a Spanish, still optimistic, sent out at first mission of the settlers from Spain under the leadership of Pedro de Mendoza. They founded a town on the site of Buenos Aires in the same year. It should have been an ideal place for Europeans. Buenos Aires, literally meaning good airs, had a hospitable, temperate climate, yet the first stay of the Spaniards there was short-lived. They were not after good airs, but resources to extract and labor to coerce. The Chiaras and the Curandi were not obliging. However, they refused to provide food to the Spaniards and refused to work when caught. They attacked the new settlement with their bows and arrows. The Spaniards grew hungry, since they had not anticipated having to provide food for themselves. Buenos Aires was not what they had dreamed of. The local people could not be forced into providing labor. The area had no silver or gold to exploit. And the silver that de Solis found had actually come all the way from the Inca state in the Andes far to the west. The Spaniards, while trying to survive, started sending out expeditions to find a new place that would offer greater riches and population easier to caress. In 1537, one of these expeditions, under the leadership of Juan de Ayolos, penetrated up the Parana River, searching for the road to the Incas. On its way, it made contact with the Guarani, a sedentary people with an agricultural economy based on maize and cassava. De Ayolos immediately realized that the Guarani were a completely different proposition from the Chiaras and the Curandi. After a brief conflict, the Spanish overcame Guarani resistance and founded a town, Nuestra Senora de Santa Maria de la Asunción, which remains the capital of Paraguay today. The conquistadors married the Guarani princess and quickly set themselves up as a new aristocracy. They adapted the existing systems of the forced labor and tribute of the Guarani with themselves at the helm. This was the kind of colony they wanted to set up, and within 4 years Buenos Aires was abandoned, as all the Spaniards who had settled there moved to the new town. Buenos Aires, the Paris of South America, a city of wide European style boulevards based on the great agricultural wealth of the Pampas, was not resettled until 1580. The abandonment of the Buenos Aires and the conquest of the Guarani reveals the logic of European colonization of the Americas. Early Spanish and, as we will say, English colonists were not interested in tilling the soil themselves. They wanted others to do it for them, and they wanted riches, gold and silver to plunder. From Cajamarca. The expeditions of de Solis, de Mendoza and de Ayalos came in the wake of more famous ones that followed Christopher Columbus' sighting of one of the islands of the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. Spanish expansion and colonization of the Americas began in earnest with the invasion of Mexico by Hernan Cortes in 1519. The expedition of Francisco Pizarro to Peru a decade and a half later, and the expedition of the Pedro de Mendoza to the Rio de la Plata just 2 years after that. Over the next century, Spain conquered and colonized most of the central, western and southern South America, while Portugal claimed Brazil to the east. The Spanish strategy of colonization was highly effective. First perfected by Cortes in Mexico, it was based on the observation that the best way for the Spanish to subdue opposition was to capture the indigenous leader. This strategy enabled the Spanish to claim that the accumulated wealth of the leader encouraged the indigenous people to give tribute and food. The next step was setting themselves up as the new elite of the indigenous society and taking control of the existing methods of taxation, tribute, and particularly forced labor. When Cortes and his men arrived at the great Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519, they were welcomed by Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor, who had decided in the face of much advice from his counselor to welcome the Spaniards peacefully. What happened next is well described by the account compiled after 1545 by the Franciscan priest Bernardo de Sohagan in his famous Florentine Codices. At once the Spanish formally seized Moctezuma, then each of the guns shot off. Fear prevailed. It was as if everyone had swallowed his heart. Even before it had grown dark, there was terror, there was astonishment, there was apprehension, there was a stunning of the people. And when it dawned, thereupon were proclaimed all the things which the Spaniards required: white tortillas, roasted turkey, hens, eggs, fresh water, wood, firewood, charcoal. This had Moctezuma indeed commanded. And when the Spaniards were well settled, they thereupon inquired of Moctezuma as to all the city's treasure. With great zeal they sought gold, and Moctezuma thereupon went leading the Spaniards. They went surrounding him, each holding him, each grasping him. And when they reached the storehouse, a place called Tohicaloco, thereupon they brought forth all the brilliant things: the quetzal feather head fan, the devices, the shields, the golden discs, the golden nose crescents,
the golden leg bands, the golden arm bands, the golden forehead bands. Thereupon was detached the gold. At once they ignited, set fire to all the precious things. They all burned, and the gold, the Spaniards formed into separate bars, and the Spanish walked everywhere. They took all that they saw, which they saw to be good. Thereupon they went to Moctezuma on storehouse at a place called Totokeloco. They brought forth Moctezuma's own property, precious things all, the necklaces with pendants, the arm bands with tufts of the quetzal feathers, the golden arm bands, the bracelets, the golden bands with shells, and the turquoise diadem, the attribute of the rural. They took it all. The military conquest of the Aztecs was completed by 1521. Cortes, as governor of the province of New Spain, then began dividing up the most valuable resources, the indigenous population, through the institution of Encomienda. The Encomienda had first appeared in 15th century Spain as part of the conquest of the south of the country from the Moors, Arabs, who had settled during and after the 18th century. In the New World, it took on much more pernicious form. It was a grant of indigenous people to a Spaniard known as encomendero. The indigenous people had to give the encomendero tribute and labor services, in exchange for which the encomendero was charged with converting them to Christianity. A vivid early account of the workings of the encomendero has come down to us from Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican priest who formulated the earliest and one of the most devastating critiques of the Spanish colonial system. De las Casas arrived on the Spanish island of the Hispaniola in 1505 with a fleet of ships led by the new governor Nicolas de Ovando. He became increasingly disillusioned and disturbed by the cruel and exploitative treatment of the indigenous people he witnessed every day. In 1513, he took part as a chaplain in the Spanish conquest of Cuba, even being granted as encomenda for his service. However, he renounced the grain and began a long campaign to reform Spanish colonial institutions. His efforts culminated in his book A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, written in 1542, a withering attack on the barbarity of the Spanish rule. On the encomenda, he has this to say in the case of Nicaragua. Each of the settlers took up residence in the town, all allotted to him or commanded to him, as the legal phrase has it, put the inhabitants to work for him, stole their already scarce foodstuffs for himself, and took over the lands owned and worked by the natives and on which they traditionally grew their own produce. The settlers would treat the whole of the native population, dignitaries, old men, women, and children, as members of his household, and as such make them labor night and day in his own interest, without any rest whatsoever. For the conquest of New Granada, modern Colombia, de las Casas reports the whole Spanish strategy in action. To realize their long-term purpose of seizing all the available gold, the Spaniards employed their usual strategy of apportioning among themselves, or in commanding as they have will, the towns and their inhabitants, and then as ever treating them as common selves. The man is over all command of the expedition seized the king of the whole territory for himself and held him prisoner for 6 or 7 months, quite illicitly demanding more and more gold and emeralds from him. This king Juan Bogota was to terrify that in his anxiety to free himself from the clutches of his tormentors, he consented to the demand that they fill an entire house with gold and hand it over. To this end, he sent his people off in search of gold, and bit by bit they brought it, along with many precious stones. But still the house was not filled, and the Spaniards eventually declared that they would put him to death for breaking his promise. The commander suggested that they should bring the case before him as a representative of the law, and when they did so, entering formal accusation against the king, he sentenced him to torture should he persist in not honoring the bargain. They tortured him with a stripedo, put burning tallow on his belly, pinned both his legs to poles with iron hoops, and his neck with another, and then, with two men holding his hands, proceeded to burn the soles of his feet. From time to time the commander would look in and repeat that they would torture him to death slowly unless he produced more gold, and this is what they did, the king eventually succumbing to the agonies they inflicted on him. The strategy and institution of conquest perfected in Mexico were eagerly adopted elsewhere in the Spanish Empire. Nowhere was this done more effectively than in Pizarro's conquest of Peru. As de las Casas begins his account, in 1531 another great villain journeyed with a number of men to the kingdom of Peru. He set out with every intention of limiting the strategy and tactics of his fellow adventurers in other parts of the New World. Pizarro began on the coast near the Peruvian town of Tumbes and marched south. On November 15, 1532, he reached the mountain town of Cajamarca, where the Inca Emperor Atahualpa was encamped with his army. The next day, Atahualpa, who had just vanquished his brother Hashakar in a contest over who would succeed their deceased father, Huayna Capac, came with his retinue to where the Spanish were camped. Atahualpa was irritated because news of atrocities that the Spanish had already committed, such as violating a temple of the sun god Enki, had reached him. What transpired next is well known. The Spanish laid a trap and sprang it. They killed Atahualpa's guards and retainers, possibly as many as 2,000 people, and captured the king. To gain his freedom, Atahualpa had to promise to fill one room with gold and two more of the same size with silver. He did this, but the Spanish, reneging on their promises, strangled him in July 1533. That November, the Spanish captured the Inca capital of Cusco, where the Incan aristocracy received the same treatment as Atahualpa.